There's a shift happening in how the Detroit Lions should be looking at the offensive tackle position right now, and it completely changes the conversation heading into the draft. The evaluation that once felt settled suddenly isn't anymore, and after a deep dive into the film and the numbers, the picture looks very different from what many expected, including the analyst whose breakdown we're following here. The biggest turning point starts with Kaden Proctor. For a while, the narrative around him was easy to buy into: raw, unrefined, better as a run blocker than a pass protector, and someone who still needed a lot of development. But when you actually go back and watch the tape and compare it with the production over time, that story doesn't fully hold up. What stands out immediately is that Proctor isn't just a massive presence on the field, he's an elite athlete for his size. At around 6'7" and well over 350 pounds, he moves in ways that players that big simply aren't supposed to move. And the pass protection concerns, they look heavily tied to context. As a true freshman in the SEC, he was thrown into the fire and gave up 12 sacks over 8-1-1 snaps. That's the kind of stat line that sticks in people's minds and shapes long-term perception. But over the next 2 seasons combined, he allowed just 5 sacks total. That's not a small improvement, that's a massive leap. Even more impressive, in his most recent season, across 611 pass blocking snaps, he allowed only 21 total pressures, hits, and hurries combined. The quarterback was touched just 6 times. That's roughly 1% of dropbacks. That's elite level production, no matter how you slice it. Now shift the focus to Blake Miller, and the conversation gets even more interesting. Coming out of Clemson, Miller brings consistency that's hard to ignore. Over the last 3 years, he allowed just 5 sacks total, with only 14 pressures given up in his most recent season. That level of reliability stands out, especially for a player who has been a pure right tackle throughout his career. And then you add in the physical traits: 84-inch arms, strong base, smooth sets, and you start to see why he's becoming such a compelling option. What makes Miller particularly intriguing for Detroit is the fit. There's a belief that he could step in and thrive immediately, especially given how the Lions structure their offensive line. His ability to anchor, control defenders, and maintain positioning and pass protection gives him a high floor, but the athletic upside suggests there's still room to grow beyond that. Then there's Monroe Freeling, another name that keeps gaining traction. While he may not have had the same level of spotlight early on, the combination of size, athleticism, and growth trajectory makes him one of the more fascinating prospects in this group. When you stack him side by side with Proctor, you're looking at 2 players who might not have been universally ranked at the top initially, but whose film tells a much stronger story. And this is where the conversation really starts to challenge the consensus. Players like Francis Mauigoa and Spencer Fano have been widely viewed as the top options, but when you break down their performance against top competition and dig into the details, there are questions. Mauigoa had solid production, including just 2 sacks allowed over 557 pass blocking snaps, but there were stretches, particularly against certain opponents, where the tape wasn't as dominant as expected. Fano, on the other hand, played in a system heavily reliant on the run, which naturally limits pass protection exposure. That doesn't invalidate his ability, but it does make projection to the NFL a bit more complicated. So when you take all of this together, the film, the numbers, the competition level, the rankings begin to shift. Instead of locking in on the consensus names, there's a growing argument that 3 players in particular might actually be more NFL ready right now: Blake Miller, Monroe Freeling, and Kaden Proctor. And here's where it ties directly back to Detroit. The Lions are one of the best possible environments for a young offensive tackle to develop. With strong coaching, a well-structured offensive line, and elite talent around them, any of these prospects would be stepping into a situation designed for growth and success. That matters. Development isn't just about the player, it's about where they land. So now the question becomes much more interesting than it was before. If the Lions are on the clock and these options are available, do they stick with the consensus rankings, or do they trust the deeper evaluation and go after the player who truly fits their system and shows the most on tape?
Because if the internal board ends up looking anything like this revised evaluation, there's a real chance Detroit surprises people on draft night. And if you're in that room making the decision, knowing what we now know from the film and production, which direction would you go? And that's exactly where the tension builds, because this isn't just about ranking players anymore, it's about philosophy. It's about whether the Detroit Lions are going to follow the public board or trust what they see when they break down every snap, every rep, every detail that doesn't always show up in headlines. When you really think about it, Brad Holmes and this front office have already shown us who they are. They are not afraid to go against the grain if they believe in their evaluation. And that's why this offensive tackle discussion feels so important, because it's not just filling a need, it's potentially shaping the future of the offensive line for years to come. Now, go back to Blake Miller for a second, because the more you sit with it, the more the fit makes sense. A pure right tackle, battle-tested, consistent over multiple seasons, and someone who has already shown he can handle high-level competition. There's a level of polish there that you don't always find, and when you combine that with his physical tools, you start to see why someone would confidently place him at the top of their board specifically for Detroit, not just as a prospect, but as a Lion. But then you look at Monroe Freeling and Kaden Proctor again, and this is where it gets difficult, because their ceiling might actually be higher. Freeling has that rare blend of size and movement that could turn him into something special if developed correctly. And Proctor, with everything we talked about earlier, might already be closer than people think. The growth from year one to now is not normal. It's the kind of progression that suggests a player is figuring things out fast. So now you're weighing something every team struggles with. Do you take the safer, more polished player, or do you bet on the higher ceiling knowing your coaching staff can unlock it? And this is where Detroit's situation changes the equation, because they're not desperate. They're not in a position where they have to rush a player onto the field before he's ready. They can afford to develop. They can afford to be patient. And when you have that luxury, sometimes the smarter move is to swing for the player who could become elite rather than just solid. At the same time, there's another layer here that can't be ignored: competition level. This kept coming up again and again in the evaluation. The tackles who faced top-tier defensive talent and held up consistently stand out differently. It's one thing to dominate in a system that protects you or against lesser competition, but it's another to prove it when the speed, strength, and complexity ramp up. That's part of why the confidence in Miller, Freeling, and Proctor keeps growing. They've shown flashes, or in some cases, sustained stretches, against real competition that translate better to what they'll see on Sundays. And for a team like the Lions, who are trying to stay at the top and not just get there, that matters a lot. So now picture draft night. The board is falling a certain way. Names are coming off faster than expected, and suddenly the decision is right there. Maybe the consensus top guys are available. Maybe one of these re-ranked options is sitting there, waiting. This is where conviction shows up. This is where all the film study, all the internal discussions, all the debates inside that building come down to one pick. And if the Lions walk away with one of those three, Blake Miller, Monroe Freeling, or Kaden Proctor, there's a strong argument that they didn't just follow the board, they beat it. Because the reality is, not all rankings are created equal. The public sees one version, teams see another. And sometimes, the difference between a good pick and a great one is trusting what you see over what everyone else expects. Now imagine this offensive line a year or two from now. A young tackle fully developed, playing alongside established talent, benefiting from elite coaching, and going up against players like Aiden Hutchinson in practice every single week. That's how players accelerate. That's how potential turns into production. So this isn't just about who's the best tackle today. It's about who becomes the best tackle in this system, in this environment, with this coaching staff. And if everything we've just broken down holds true, the Lions might be in a position to land not just a starter, but a cornerstone. If you had to make that call right now, knowing the difference between immediate readiness and long-term upside, are you taking the safer option like Blake Miller, or are you betting on the ceiling with someone like Monroe Freeling or Kaden Proctor? Because once you start thinking beyond just the pick itself, the ripple effect across the entire roster becomes impossible to ignore. This isn't happening in isolation. Whoever the Lions bring in at tackle is stepping into a room that already has identity, already has leadership, and already has expectations that are much higher than they were just a couple of years ago. And that's what makes this decision even more critical. You're not drafting a project just to see what happens. You're drafting someone who needs to align with a team that believes it can compete at the highest level right now. So let's take it one layer deeper. If the Lions go with Blake Miller, what they're really saying is they value stability and readiness. They're betting on a player who has already shown he can handle his assignment snap after snap, game after game. That kind of reliability is something coaches trust very quickly. It means fewer mistakes, fewer breakdowns, and a smoother transition into meaningful snaps early in his career. For a team with playoff expectations, that has real value. But if they go with Monroe Freeling or Kaden Proctor, the message shifts slightly. It becomes about maximizing what this offensive line could be, not just what it is today. It's about trusting the development system, trusting the coaching, and believing that in a year, or maybe even sooner, you're going to have a player who isn't just holding his own, but potentially dominating. And let's be honest, that's how great offensive lines are built. Not just with solid players, but with difference makers. Another piece that keeps coming back into focus focus is how these players handle adversity. When you watch Proctor's early struggles and then see the way he corrected them over time, that tells you something about his mentality. That tells you he could process, adjust, and improve. Those are traits you can't teach easily, and they matter just as much as physical ability. With Freeling, it's the projection that stands out. You see flashes where everything clicks, the movement, the power, the control, and you start imagining what that looks like when it becomes consistent. That's where the superstar conversation begins to creep in, not as hype, but as a realistic outcome if everything develops the right way. And with Miller, it's the confidence that what you see is what you get in a good way. There's a clarity to his game. He understands positioning, timing, leverage. He's not guessing out there. And for a coaching staff, that's incredibly valuable because it allows them to build around him without worrying about constant adjustments. So now you've got three very different paths, all leading to potential success, but each requiring a different kind of belief. And here's the part that fans should really lock in on. The Lions don't need to force anything. That's the luxury they've earned. They can let the board come to them. They can stay disciplined. And when the moment comes, they can take the player who fits exactly what they want to build, whether that's immediate impact or long-term dominance. But don't be surprised if the name they call doesn't match what the national media expects. Because based on everything we've just walked through, there's a real chance the Lions' internal rankings look very different from the consensus. And if that's the case, draft night could bring a decision that feels surprising on the surface, but makes perfect sense when you understand the full evaluation behind it. So as this all plays out, keep one thing in mind. This isn't just about replacing or adding a tackle. It's about continuing to build one of the most important units on the team into something that can carry them deep into the postseason. And if they get this right, it might not just be a good pick. It could be the move that keeps this team competing at the top for years to come. And the more you sit with that idea, the more you realize this decision is also about timing. Not just who these players are, but when they become who they're going to be. Because in the NFL, timing can be the difference between a good roster and a championship level one. If Detroit believes their window is fully open right now, there's a strong case for leaning toward the player who minimizes risk early. Someone who can step in, execute, and not be a liability in high-pressure moments. That's where a profile like Blake Miller keeps making sense over and over again. He doesn't need everything to be perfect around him to function. He's already shown he can handle his role with consistency, and that kind of reliability becomes even more valuable when the games start to matter more. But if the Lions are thinking not just about this season, but about sustaining success over multiple years, then the conversation shifts again. Because that's where players like Monroe